Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Today I have a story for you that could actually be a horror film. This is an old story, but it's one I hadn't heard before, and it is truly terrifying. We aren't talking about New Jersey here in the States today. We are talking about the tiny island of Jersey, which sits between England and France. Years ago, when people started reporting terrifying stories of a figure wearing a grotesque mask, the inhabitants of this tiny island began living in fear, and they had very good reason to feel afraid. This is the story of the Beast of Jersey. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. The island of Jersey is a stunningly beautiful, tiny island in a chain called the Channel Islands. Photos look like something out of an epic movie with white houses dotting the green hills that roll out of the sea and a foreboding-looking castle called Mont Orgueil. The castle overlooks the harbor of Forey, which has stood on this island since 1212. It is over 800 years old. The oldest building in America is half that old. The castle was used as a fortress of defense until it became a prison in the 1600s, and 100 years after that, it became housing for the island's soldiers. Currently, it's a visitor attraction, and millions of pounds have been spent on ensuring it stays standing for another 800 years. Jersey served as a staging post for attacks on the British Isles during the Napoleonic Wars and World War II. The military history there is quite fascinating, but Jersey is also known for its beautiful beaches. The deep blue water rises to the white sands, and many say Jersey has the best beaches in the British Isles. The tiny island is a major producer of dairy goods and produce because of the humid climate, but it's best known for, as you've probably guessed, the Jersey cow. The Jersey cattle breed originated on this tiny island over 200 years ago. It's one of the oldest cattle breeds. Jersey cows are not produced for their meat, though they can be eaten, and some people actually prefer their meat to things like Angus, but the cows are raised for milk production. Jersey cow milk contains a 20% higher amount of butter fat than any other breed's milk, which means it makes the most delicious milk, butter, and ice cream. And great, now I want ice cream. The island also makes a great home for sheep, and a lot of wool is produced and exported from the island. Even though the island is tiny, there are 100,000 people that live there and make their homes there. But back in the 1950s, the island was much less populated. There were only 30,000 people there back then. Life was peaceful and calm until it wasn't. The inhabitants of the island were plunged into a terrifying time when horrific crimes began being committed by what some were calling a monster. The terror began in 1957 and continued through 1971. In February of 1957, after a night shift, a nurse was waiting for a bus in the Monte Lobby area of the island. As the woman sat and waited for the bus, she heard someone approach her. When she turned to look, she was horrified to see a man dressed in a long coat with a scarf over his face, wearing sunglasses. This was at night. The man said nothing but raised his arm over his head and brought a heavy object down over the woman, bloodying her head, hitting her so hard that she was dazed. The man tied a rope around the woman's neck and dragged her to a nearby field. There, he beat the woman and sexually assaulted her. The nurse was in and out of consciousness during the attack and couldn't remember parts of what happened. And there was something else. The man's face was covered, but not with the scarf he'd been wearing at the beginning of the attack. The nurse caught some glimpses of what the man was wearing during the attack, and it looked inhuman. After the assault, the man got up and ran into the woods nearby, leaving the nurse in the field where she was soon discovered wandering and bleeding by a passerby. The police were called and the woman was taken to the hospital for stitches in her head, and she was treated for the wounds left by the rope on her neck. As the police interviewed the victim, she told them that her attacker spoke very strangely. His voice was deep, almost a growl, and it sounded to her as though he was faking an Irish accent. And there was something else. He smelled bad. He smelled musty, as if he was wearing old clothes that had been stored in a chest, and his breath was horrible. Ugh. This was, as you can imagine, a very big deal on this tiny island. 30,000 people living in such a tiny place is a close-knit community. Most of the people on the island knew each other or knew of each other, and now they had to come to terms with the fact that one of the people living amongst them was very, very dangerous. This is a place where crime is almost non-existent, at least back in the 1950s, and people were terrified. As rumors of this man wearing a scary mask, using a strange voice that had a bad smell, spread around the inhabitants of the island, their fear grew. The local newspaper began calling the attacker the Beast of Jersey, and this moniker only added to the already tense atmosphere on the island. And then it happened again. In March of 1957, a 20-year-old woman was walking home along the cobblestones from a bus stop near Trinity. Suddenly, a man wearing a terrible mask jumped from the bushes and grabbed the woman. Again, a rope was thrown around her neck, and before she knew it, she was being dragged. The woman immediately realized what was happening to her, as she had heard the stories of the previous attack and assault. It all happened for a second time. Again, the woman was attacked with something heavy, hitting her on the head, and again, she was dragged into a field by her neck and she was sexually assaulted. This woman was taken to the hospital for treatment, and she described her terrible ordeal to the police. With two attacks so close together and both women describing the same attacker, the police knew they had a serial offender. Several weeks went by as police continued to investigate. They went door to door looking for the assailant, speaking to everyone in each of the areas of the attacks. How were they to know if one of the seemingly friendly neighbors they spoke to was actually the monster the police were looking for? People began locking their doors and going in pairs to bus stops. Dairy farmers kept their weapons loaded by the front door, and everyone was on alert. They hoped that the assailant was just passing through the area and that it was over, but they were not so fortunate. In July, a 31-year-old woman was attacked in much the same manner. She was grabbed and a rope was thrown around her neck after she was hit over the head with something heavy. The woman was dragged into a nearby field, again with a rope. The field was overgrown with bushes, and there she was sexually assaulted. She was left severely injured with damage to her esophagus from the rope around her neck. She had been nearly strangled. Again, the woman was taken to the hospital and she reported the same details as the first two victims. The man was wearing a terrible, inhuman-looking mask. He spoke in a very low voice and made growling and gurgling noises, and he smelled bad. People were already afraid, but this third attack pushed them over the edge. Area men began patrolling the streets at night. Volunteers sat at bus stops to ensure women would be safe, and the police even brought in extra assistance from London. For a while, this seemed to help. The attacks stopped, but not for long. After 14 months of respite from the attacks, the Jersey Beast returns. A 28-year-old woman is walking in the parish of St. Martin on Jersey. The beast jumps from the bushes and throws a rope around her neck. The woman immediately knew what was happening, and this time, the beast had chosen the wrong victim. This woman was bigger in stature than the beast, whose victims reported as a short man standing only around 5'6" tall. The fourth victim begins to fight and struggle, and the beast cannot get control over her. The taller woman is kicking and screaming, using her legs to fight back as she lays on the ground while the beast tries to drag her. As she looks up, she gets the first really good look at the attacker. This woman had not been hit over the head, and she was not dazed. On top of that, there was a nearby street light that allowed her to get a better look than the first three victims. As this woman is laying on the ground, being attacked and fighting for her life, she is terrified to see the mask that people have been talking about. It's a loosely fitting rubber mask with eye holes cut out and what appears to be extra skin hanging off the edges. It was rubber, but it was made to look like skin. The mask is torn and jagged around the jawline, adding to the monstrous appearance. The woman is so strong that the beast gives up and runs away. The police are disturbed to hear that there has been another attack. And at this point, the head of the department realizes this is out of our scope and he requests assistance from more seasoned detectives in London. The fourth victim tells the police about everything she saw, but also everything she smelled. She said the man smelled of urine and that his breath was horrible. She was close enough to smell his breath. She said the man was short and strong, but that yes, he spoke with a low voice, almost growling, and to her it sounded as if he was speaking in a fake Irish accent. So at this point in time, they know this has been the same guy every single time. This attack and failure to complete the attack seems to change something in the beast's mind. He decides that these street ambushes are no longer safe or working for him, and he changes his tactics in the most disturbing manner. It's now Valentine's Day in 1960. A 12-year-old boy sleeping on the second floor of his house had his window open. He is awakened by a noise, and he later recalls the first thing he noticed was a horrible smell. As the boy is waking up, he sees a man standing at the foot of his bed. The man is wearing a mask, and he clicks on a flashlight, which he shines in the boy's eyes. The boy is blinded by the light. The next thing he knows, a rope was thrown around his head, and he feels the fibers begin to pull at his neck. The boy is dragged from the bedroom by the rope and down the stairs. I wish I had more information as to why the sound of this did not wake up anyone else in the house, but apparently it did not. I did read some accounts that said the beast threatened the young boy that if he made noise, he would kill him. The beast drags the boy outside the house and into a nearby field where the boy is sexually assaulted. This is absolutely horrific for all of the victims, every single one of them, but this must have been especially terrifying for this young boy. When the assault was over, the man walked the boy back to his house and disappeared into the night. The young boy wakes his parents, who immediately call the police. You can imagine the horror of the next 24 hours as people learn that not only is the beast now attacking children, he's attacking them in their own homes. Going from a street attack to a home invasion and abduction is a major shift in tactic, and it sends residents back into panic mode. The boy told the police that yes, the man was wearing a scary-looking mask, yes, he was wearing a long coat, and yes, he smelled very, very bad. The most terrifying aspect of this attack for investigators was the realization that this assailant did not care if his victim was male or female, adult or child. He was simply looking to take and assault anyone he could get at. People were once again living in fear, but this time it was worse. They now knew they weren't safe even in their own homes. Parents nailed their children's windows shut so they couldn't open them. The sale of knives went up. Single women began staying at each other's houses so they wouldn't be alone. And the atmosphere of fear was next level. This is an isolated community, obviously, on a small island, and someone living amongst them was an actual monster taking and sexually assaulting people. It must have felt a bit claustrophobic, don't you think? As if this change in tactic was not bad enough, a sixth attack would make things even worse. In March of 1960, a woman was walking to a bus stop in the St. Brelade parish. A man pulled up next to her in his car and offered her a ride. He said he was a doctor and he was on his way to pick up his wife. The man was older and the woman didn't suspect anything was off, so she got in the car and the two drove off. The woman then turned to speak to the man and she got a better look at him. He was wearing a long overcoat, a hat, and gloves. The area where he'd stopped to pick this woman up was on the edge of town, and within a minute or so, they were in an isolated area on the island. The man suddenly let go of the steering wheel with one hand and punched the woman very hard in the face. He slammed on the brakes and pulled a rope out from under his seat, which he used to tie the woman's hands behind her back. He then dragged her from the car into a nearby field where she was sexually assaulted. The beast then pulled the woman back to the car, put her in the passenger seat, and began to drive. She sat terrified, wondering where he was taking her, and she realized she had to get out of that car. The woman opened the passenger door and jumped from the moving car. She began screaming before she hit the ground. Panicked by the noise and the fear that someone saw this, the man sped away. The police were called. The woman gave the police all of the details, and they matched those of previous victims. Investigators were hopeful that this time, because the woman had seen the car and the man's face, they might be able to track the beast down. But there was a problem. The man had shaggy long hair hanging down in his face. The woman thought it might be a wig, and he wore a newsboy-style cap that he had pulled down low. So the woman didn't get a good look at him. Now, me personally, of course, I am very safety conscious. I'm not getting into a car with anybody, and you shouldn't either. So now the cops had 4 assaults on women walking on the street, 1 home abduction, and 1 vehicular abduction. What was going to happen next? It was worse than what anyone could imagine. Just weeks later, still in March of 1960, a 43-year-old woman and her 14-year-old daughter were asleep in their home on a remote part of the island. After midnight, the phone rang. The woman was awakened and went downstairs to answer the phone. She said, "Hello?" But there was no answer. All she heard was a click and then a dial tone. She assumed it was a wrong number and she went back to bed. Just after she fell back asleep, she was awakened again by a noise. The woman was aware of the attacks on the island and she was being very cautious. She walked out of her bedroom and flipped the light switch at the top of the stairs before beginning to walk down them. When she reached the bottom step, she heard a light switch flick and the lights went out. The woman sensed a presence in the room and she realized she wasn't alone. She ran to the phone to call the police, but when she held the receiver to her ear, there was no dial tone. Someone had cut the phone line. The woman was standing in the dark, shaking and terrified, and then she saw him. Through the darkness, a figure ran at the woman. This is like my worst nightmare. Within a second, the beast was on top of her. He grabbed the woman, and as he spoke, a terrible smell washed over her. The beast said, "Give me all the money you have, or I'll kill you." The woman screamed and began to struggle. This woke her daughter, who got out of bed and went to the top of the stairs. The woman was horrified when the man pushed her away and lunged up the stairs, skipping steps as he went to get to the young girl. What this woman did next, I do not understand. Thankfully, I have never been in this situation, but I do not believe this is what I would have done. The woman ran from her house to the neighbor's house, leaving her daughter alone with the beast. Yeah, that's going to be a no for me. By the time the woman returned to her house, her daughter had been sexually assaulted. She was tied up, but she was alive. The police arrived and found that the beast had broken into the house. The locks were old and easy to overcome, and now they had another home invasion and attack. I cannot even imagine living in this type of atmosphere. This would be like living in a really small town, feeling safe in your home. Your children are safe in their home, and then all of a sudden, you're not safe at all. There were no alarm systems like we have now, but I'll tell you what, I would have gone and purchased the biggest, loudest dog I could find, or even better, the littlest, loudest dog I can find. No doubt, dogs are great alarms. You cannot get within 100 feet of my house, which is covered with cameras and alarms and other things, but my dogs let me know first. My dogs give me plenty of time to get to my sidearm. They let me know when anybody is near my house. Even before you could throw a rock through my window, my dogs have already let me know. Even little Mulder has joined in, and he's not even 6 months old yet. Those little Pomeranian ears are like nothing else. Somebody walks on the sidewalk out front, I know. I've had to really train my dogs to stay at my feet when I film, because if somebody goes by the house, they start barking, but they know when I'm in this chair and they're at my feet, they're not allowed to bark. Are you learning to be a good guard dog, buddy? It's taken him a little bit of time to learn that he can't bark when he's in here. Do you want to get picked up? No. Okay, not today. So 2 weeks go by, everybody's living in fear, and then it happened again. In April of 1960, a 14-year-old girl was startled out of her sleep. Standing at the foot of her bed was a man in a grotesque mask watching her sleep. It is truly the stuff of nightmares, the stuff of horror movies. The girl began screaming and her parents woke up. They rushed into their daughter's room just in time to see the man fleeing through the front door. The girl was left unharmed. 2 months later, in July, an 8-year-old boy was awakened by a rope being tied around his neck. He was dragged from his house and sexually assaulted in a nearby field. He was then walked back to his house, delivered right to his doorstep, and once again, he told the same story of the mask, the overcoat, and the terrible smell. The police ramped up the investigation. They put out the word that any man with a criminal record was required to come to the police station and check in. Every single adult male on the island was asked to be fingerprinted. Only 13 men of the 12,000 living on the island refused to give their fingerprints. One of those men who refused would turn out to be the Beast of Jersey. A man named Alphonse Legassoula was arrested under suspicion of being the Beast of Jersey. He was a fisherman who lived on the island, and people had always believed him to be a bit off. He was strange. The police were admittedly grasping at straws. They'd been looking into every eccentric man on the island. After 14 hours of questioning, Alphonse was released for lack of evidence, but the damage had been done. His name had been leaked to the press, and his photo was all over the news, even reaching London. An angry mob burned down Alphonse's house. He was forced to leave the island and relocate. His entire life was ruined, and he was not the Beast of Jersey. Alphonse was forced to live in isolation, dying in 2012 at age 97. And this is just another example of how these crimes affect so many other people than the actual victim. I feel really sorry for this guy. 6 months went by, and then the Beast returned in February of 1961. Between February and April, 3 children were taken from their homes and assaulted. All were then returned to their homes. People were hysterical at this point. The island was no longer safe, and the police were at a total loss. And that's when Scotland Yard stepped in. Officers from Scotland Yard came to the island in large numbers and began patrolling the streets of the island. Neighborhood watch groups were organized, and residents took turns assisting the police. Scotland Yard created a simplistic early profile of the assailant, which said, 40 to 45 years old and approximately 5'6" in height with medium build. He knows the island well, especially the East Coast. He has a mustache, but covers his face either with a scarf or a mask during the attacks. He wears a long, dark, musty coat, a hat, and a pair of gloves. He enters homes through bedroom windows, using the moon as a light between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m., and he carries a torch, which is a flashlight. The presence of Scotland Yard scared the Beast off, and the attacks stopped for 2 years, but they hadn't seen the last of the Beast of Jersey. A 9-year-old boy was taken from his home, dragged by a rope around his neck. In November, it happened again to an 11-year-old boy. In July and August of 1964, a 10-year-old girl and then a 10-year-old boy were abducted and assaulted. 2 years went by with no further attacks, and people finally began to relax. And then the letter arrived. In 1966, the police on the island received a letter that said, "My dear sir, I think that it is just the time to tell you that you are just wasting your time, as every time I have done what I always intended to do. And remember, it will not stop at this, but I will be fair to you and give you a chance. I have never had much out of this life, but I intend to get everything I can now. I have always wanted to do the perfect crime. I have done this, but this time let the moon shine very bright in September, because this time it must be perfect. Not one, but two. I am not a maniac by a long shot, but I like to play with you people. You will hear from me before September, and I will give you all the clues just to see if you can catch me. Yours very sincerely, Wait and See." These guys are just demented, The Beast of Jersey did not hold to his word. In August, weeks before September, a 15-year-old girl was brutally assaulted in her home, but her attack was very different. Her body was intentionally covered in long scratches that were inflicted in near-perfect parallel lines. This was very confusing for the investigators. The beast then went quiet for another 4 years. In August of 1970, almost 4 years to the day after that attack, a 14-year-old boy awoke from his sleep to find a flashlight shining in his face. He was taken from his home, assaulted, and returned. But this time, as the beast walked the boy back to his house, he said, "Stay quiet, because if you don't, someone will harm your mother and father." The boy's parents could tell something was wrong with him that morning. He wouldn't speak at all about what happened, so they took their son to the hospital, and upon examination, the doctors found the same parallel scratch marks as the victim from 4 years earlier. The boy finally agreed to speak, and he told the police that the man had spiky black hair and a frightening mask. And then, as we so often see, it all came to a close, not with a bang, but with a traffic stop. On July 10th, 1970, around midnight, 2 patrol officers attempted to stop a man for running a red light. When the cops turned their lights and sirens on, the man sped away. The officers chased the driver, who seemed desperate to get away from them. The man was driving wildly, and he crashed on the wrong side of the road, stopping in a tomato field. He got out of the car and tried to run, but the police tackled him to the ground and put him in handcuffs. When they put the man in the back of the car, the first thing they noticed was a terrible smell. I have to keep smelling my perfume because I'm grossed out. The police drove the man to the station and searched him. Sewn in the hemline of his long coat, the police officers found perfectly spaced nails pointed side out, and they realized this was what caused the parallel scratches they'd found on the last 2 victims. This man had intentionally added nails to his coat. Just sick. The police emptied the man's pockets and found a black flashlight with tape covering the majority of the glass, so only a pinprick of light would shine through. The man also had 2 pieces of rope with him and a roll of duct tape. He was wearing a wool newsboy cap, and in his car, they found a spiky black wig. And then they found the mask. I find these photos absolutely terrifying. The man was Edward Paynell. He was born in 1925, making him 46 years old at the time. He was from a wealthy family. He worked in construction and had served in World War II, where he had been imprisoned for a month by German officers for stealing food for starving families. This is like John Wayne Gacy doing charity work and Hitler loving his dog. People doing horrible things that then do something very out of character. Edward Paynell had no criminal record. His wife worked at a children's foster home, and each year, Edward played Santa Claus at Christmas. The kids at the foster home called him Uncle Ted. The monster had been living right under their noses. Edward's wife was brought in. She said her husband had almost no sex drive, but police uncovered at least one mistress Edward was seeing at the time. Who are these women that are sleeping with someone that smells like this? Edward's wife had not suspected a thing. When the police questioned Edward about the mask, he made up a story about attending an orgy, and he didn't want to be recognized at it. And for me, checkmark, one more reason not to be interested in orgies. Hey, if that's your thing, do your thing. The mere fact that somebody like Edward could show up is, nope. He said the nails were in his coat in case he was attacked. Police officers were sent to Edward's house. There, they found a locked secret room inside the couple's bedroom. They broke into the room and were immediately hit with a terrible smell. The room was full of old clothing and homemade wigs with matching fake eyebrows. They found a camera in the room and photographs of houses all over the island. Edward Paynell had been stalking his victims, taking photos of their houses and cataloging who lived there. Edward would later say that he followed his victims for years. It's just absolutely terrifying. Everything about this story could actually be a horror film. Also in this locked room was a shrine to Satan, which included an altar, a sword, and a large collection of books about black magic and the occult. This is actually one of the cases that investigators and experts refer to as an influence on the age of satanic panic. I didn't know that. I love learning new things about stories I have not heard before. Edward Paynell was put on trial, and on the 29th of November, 1971, it took a jury only 38 minutes to find him guilty on 13 counts of rape, indecent assault, and sodomy against 6 of his victims. He was sentenced to 30 years in Winchester Prison in the UK, but was released after only 20 years. Edward was set free in 1991, and that is unbelievable to me. As an American, you get 21 years for one attack. Edward tried living on the island, but he was run off by locals. He moved to the Isle of Wight, and 3 years after his release, he dropped dead of a heart attack in 1994. Decades later, in 2007, a child abuse investigation named Operation Rectangle was opened after children in foster care on the island who had become adults began coming forward with stories of horrific abuse. Inside one of the foster care centers, police found 65 baby teeth hidden in the basement, along with shackles under the dirt, which were attached to the walls. Arrests were made on that case. I'll cover it if you would like to hear it. And to this day, it is believed that Edward Paynell took part in that abuse. Edward Paynell terrorized this small, peaceful island for more than a decade. People who have studied this case believe there are many other victims who never came forward. There is no doubt many residents of this beautiful island fell victim to the evil deeds committed by the Beast of Jersey. Thank you so much for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. A special thank you to my patrons. Your support means the world to me. You know, I've got 2 podcasts. This one is called Dining with Death. This one is called Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee, and both of the podcasts are on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon. It would mean a lot to me if you would leave me a review. You know, we're in the midst of a fundraiser. Watch this short little video on my channel, and it will tell you all our community is doing to raise money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that's never been tested. We are trying to help solve some cold cases. I appreciate you guys so much. I really look forward to talking to you in the comments. You're really one of the only things that's keeping me sane right now. There is just a lot going on that is so disturbing and a lot of things that make me really sad. And you guys help keep me sane, and I appreciate you. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.